A very warm welcome to all of you and welcome to the session of this T20. And we will start with people. And as you heard before from the Deputy Foreign Minister Marina Sereni, Italy has decided to put people at the very core of its G20 agenda, because people have been the hardest hit due to this pandemic, that it's over a year now that's been hitting the whole world, and people will have to start again from the people, and the scars that have to be healed are enormous. Natalie Tocci talked about crossroads. Yes, of course, 2021 will be a crossroads, and the G20 is an opportunity that the countries can take, governments can take, to swing the societies this way or the other. And it was even more crucial this year than it has ever been since. People, as you know, and I think I will not be very long in that. I mean, people have been the ones who have been worst hit. The social challenges, the increased poverty, inequalities, I mean, all this have increased enormously. Now, before introducing the four panelists, I would like to introduce a video contribution by Virginia Gamba, the Special Representative of the UN Secretary General for Children and Armed Conflict. And we have asked her to give us her own priority regarding people for the G20. So please.
Ladies and gentlemen, the G20 must lead the change towards a better and brighter future for the entire global society. Building a more inclusive global society implies protecting the most vulnerable, and protecting children affected by armed conflict should thus be a priority. As we speak, the lives of millions of boys and girls are disrupted by war. Children trapped in armed conflict are abused and used as a primary fuel of groups waging war. The impact of conflict on future generations may sow the seeds for wars to continue or to re-emerge. Schools and hospitals are being attacked or occupied by armed groups or forces, denying children the right to education and health care. Boys and girls are being abducted, sexually abused, trafficked, or killed. Children also continue to be recruited and used either on the front lines or in support functions. The consequence of these attacks on the well-being and long-term development of these children is the situation has been aggravated by the COVID-19 pandemic, with children in war zones even more vulnerable to violence, and with their hope for an education and a future further diminished. Additional socioeconomic impacts on vulnerable populations resulting from the pandemic could create more push and pull factors for child recruitment and use, sexual violence, or abduction by parties to conflict. To break cycles of violence and guarantee peace, we must protect children from the impact of conflict and protect their rights. Parties to conflict, whether governmental forces or non-state armed groups, must keep schools and hospitals safe and not use them for military purposes. I call upon all parties to conflict to abide by their obligations under international law and prevent attacks against education and health facilities, as well as other civilian infrastructure and protected personnel. I appeal to all G20 states to endorse the Safe Schools Declaration and to take steps to fully live up to their commitments to guarantee that schools are protected spaces. We must also ensure that health facilities remain protected and open to children. In addition, we must strengthen our specialized capacity on the ground. Child protection advisors and practitioners are key to enabling the protection of children affected by war. They collect the information, provide reports, and engage with parties to conflict. All G20 states should support such expertise and consider it as an essential function when intervening in conflict situations. I ask you today to act together to protect children trapped in and by armed conflict. They rely on us, on you, to get the protection and support they desperately need and deserve. Thank you.
Well, Virginia Gamba asks us to start from children, and rightly so. And as I think we'll see during this discussion, COVID-19, the pandemic, works as an accelerator of all what is good and what is evil. And now I'd like to move quickly forward. I would like to present our panelists. I'll start by Pascal Lalotti, Director of the United Nations University International Institute for Global Health. Thank you very much for joining us. And then Tito Boeri, he is Professor of Economics at the Bocconi Society and former President of the Italian Social Security Administration. That was quite a headache for various years, I suppose. And then, of course, we have Emma Bonino. She was our former foreign minister. She is Senator of the Italian Republic and former European Commission. And James McGann, Director of Think Tank and Civil Societies Program at the Lauder Institute, University of Pennsylvania. There has been a slight change of plan due to, incoming obligations, and so Emma Bonino, she will have to leave us, as you heard before. I mean, we are having quite a stressful moment, let's say, at the moment in Italy, internal politics. But so I would like immediately to give the floor to Emma Bonino, that I welcome very much. And what I can say, having known her for now many years, that if there is a real fighter, that is her. I have known her since the 1970s. She has always been vocal on the streets and in the places of power and outside for women's rights, for abortion rights, the rights to divorce. And I mean, that's always been her. And she has not stopped, it seems. Because now I would like to ask her to give us her point of view regarding probably the most delicate issue regarding people. The most vulnerable people are migrants. And as we just said, the global pandemic has worked as an accelerator, and fragile countries, fragile situations have become even more so. So we have in the Sahel region, thousands of people blocked between poverty, famine, and war. In Europe, in the Balkans, we have got thousands of people in this moment, present day, blocked in the snow, in the cold. So what do you ask from the G20? How should they contribute? And what is your view on the main shortcomings that need to be addressed? Emma Bonino, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you to everybody. I think we have to realize that the G20 is a very important meeting, but will not come out with, let's say, legal binding solution. Nevertheless, it's very important, for instance, in the subject which I've been asked to chair in migration. Because I think that one thing really the G20 could do is to shift the culture of migration and come to an agreement that migration is not a phenomenon that will disappear, but it's a phenomenon which has been with us since the beginning of humanity for any reasons, need, curiosity, whatever, and it will stay with us. So national barriers, all these kind of things are not only against the international convention, but also are totally impracticable and useless. Now, I just would like to realize why the G20 should care. Because the G20 countries host 166 million migrants. 166 million of migrants, meaning the 61% of all migrants worldwide, who are 272. So this 160 million people are in the end of the G20. And there is no possible solution, in my idea, that exclude them from our path ahead. I also think that rather than the problem, they must be part of the solution. And that what we have faced for decades, and particularly in some countries, and particularly in recent time, is not a refugee crisis, but rather a refugee policy crisis. Anyhow, they will be with us, they will stay with us, and I think that here, or in the country of origin, there is a basic need now. I would like, I don't want to preempt the work of the task force on migrants, but I would like to stress the need in this particular moment to see vaccination and vaccine as a common good in order not to increase the divides between the rich country and quote unquote poor country, which is a real risk. The fact that the impact is big in every country, but we have to be sure to make all our efforts not to increase this divide between rich country and less affluent countries. So the question of stating that vaccine and vaccination and vaccine are common good. They are not only public good, they are common good for everybody. And I think that, yes, the list will be very long. The risk of G20, as usual, is to be a list of wishful thinking, but we should focus on some priorities. And we will see the work of the task force, particularly also on the women issue in the migrant population that is not at the attention of anyone. And the second, be also clear that financial support is decreasing and decreasing. And even the remittances are in decline, heavy decline, 20% in 2020, according to the World Bank. So I can end it here. I don't expect some miracle or legislative binding, but yes, we should work on these two, the cultural change, the vaccine and vaccination, and the question of impact, and consider the migrant people on the move, 166 million in the G20, as part of the solution, not only the problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma Bonino. Can I ask before you leave us, which is the situation that worries you most, and where would you ask the G20 to make the first and real commitment?
Well, I would say that the first, I repeat myself, but to see that people on the move must be part of the solution of our way of living. Nobody will stop them. We have seen this phenomenon since a long, long time. So stop any kind of wording like invasion, etc., etc. No, this is a structural phenomenon that we have to manage. The second, I said already, vaccine and health as common good. not only public good in our country, but a common good for everybody. The third one is to put particular attention to the most fragile among these fragile people, meaning women, mother or not mother, young or not young, but women are key in also the eventual practice of integration and so on and so forth. I don't think that G20 can go deeper in analyzing the national situation, etc., etc. But these 3 points must be at the attention, I'm sure.
Emma Bonino, thank you very much for being with us. And I know that you have to rush off, but it's been a pleasure seeing you again.
Grazie. Ciao.
Ciao, grazie. Now, well, we'll carry on as we had formally planned. So each panelist, I would ask them to answer first question, and then we'll, after that, we go on with the second round of questions, and afterwards we can take questions from the public. So Emma Bonino left us with the urge to address cultural crisis, the cultural problems regarding migrants, and especially health problems. Now, I would like to ask Dr. Pascal Alotti, Director of the United Nations University International. Hello and welcome. I mean, to tell us what one can ask, what G20 can do to address the inequality in resources regarding vaccines, because we all know, I mean, from this pandemic, the only way out is through vaccination, but there is an inequality in distribution, and that is it's becoming more and more evident as months go by, and it will become more and more dramatic. So what do you ask, and what from G20, what could that commitment really be to overcome this equality?
Thank you very much, and warm greetings from Kuala Lumpur. I think the early leadership by WHO and partners in COVAX is a very clear illustration of the importance of multilateralism in this space. COVAX started with a strong equity rhetoric, but the actual release of the vaccine then shifted that to a wave of vaccine nationalism. This was unfortunate but unsurprising, given the combination of scarcity of a critical resource, political interests, and evolutionary protectionism. However, we now know the vaccine landscape. There are multiple suppliers and products and growing evidence on efficacy and safety, so there should be less pressure to scramble and a return to a focus on global equity, recognizing the unequal purchasing power across countries. Course correction to the principles of global equity is critical both across and within countries. Like the scramble to vaccine nationalism, there is already evidence of the abuse and of the abuse of power in politics in as simple as defining the categories of who should be prioritized and considered essential personnel. And the idea of protection of the most vulnerable doesn't feature in the policies of several of the low and middle income countries, and accountability will be meaningless without clear guiding principles and standards. A colleague of mine in Europe showed me a number very proudly and a date symbolizing her place in the queue for the COVID vaccine. For her, it was a symbol of an end to chronic uncertainty. There are countries that are not even in a global queue. There will be no end to chronic uncertainty anywhere for anyone, or a path to economic recovery if developing countries remain unvaccinated. This relates to the risks of ongoing viral mutations resistant to current health technologies. In addition, developing countries carry a significant proportion of production of the global economy, 60% of world GDP by 2030. And perhaps this is not the best example for public health, but a thriving chocolate industry is dependent on ongoing health and survival of the cocoa farmers in Ghana. The pandemic has illuminated just how deeply unequal our world is. The response, however, has to go beyond age-old charitable models. We have an opportunity here to engage with the causes and long-term solutions for global equity. So from the perspective of the G20, ensuring equitable access to vaccines opens up an opportunity to revisit debt relief initiatives, interest-free loans, and other models that will enhance the ability of developing countries to, in turn, increase their investments in global public goods, putting them in a stronger position to engage in COVAX and other related programs. The G20 needs to recognize the relevance of regional blocs such as the African Union and regional development banks as partners in the global effort. So to summarize, the G20 can, one, end vaccine nationalism and trust in a multilateral system that can help to support equity, recognize that none of us returns to normal, new or otherwise, unless we're all assured the pathway to prevention. Three, engage with initiatives that enable developing countries to be at the table to discuss access for their populations. And finally, additional investment from the G20 countries into equitable access is a good investment for all of our futures, not just because it makes economic sense, but because it's the right thing to do.
Thank you, Professor Loti. And well, we'll get back to that on the second round of questions. Now, I would like to address Tito Boeri, the Professor of Economics at the Bocconi University and our former President of the Italian Social Security Administration. Professor, good morning. I'd like to ask you about economic and social inequalities that the global pandemic is increasing substantially. So what do you think one can still do to prevent it?
Well, first of all, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are located. And thank you so much for having me. Maria, you asked a very relevant question. Thank you so much for raising this issue. Because, you know, income losses associated to the pandemic have been concentrated on those who were already at the bottom of the income ladder to start with. It has been estimated at the World Bank that between 88 and 115 million people were pushed back into extreme poverty by COVID-19. And these were set back, de facto, poverty reduction plans by about 5 years. Even in relatively high-income countries, unskilled workers, notably those who were employed in those sectors that had been most hardly hit by the lockdowns, such as transportation, tourism, restaurants, entertainments, have lost their jobs and will find it hard to be re-employed. New dimension of inequality, of opportunities in particular, arose adding to the pre-existing ones. School closure closed de facto the most powerful social elevator. Remote working is being imposed also to workers experiencing difficult housing conditions. And this regression to the organization of work that was prevailing before the Industrial Revolution is increasing inequalities in working conditions even among workers of the same firm and having the same skills and experience. Not only economic risk, but also health contagion risk is concentrated among some of the most disadvantaged groups. And among those who survive from COVID-19 infections, many bear the scars that are bound to reduce significantly their capacity to generate income for their families. Several G20 countries introduced mitigation measures aimed at supporting individuals not in condition to work during the pandemic, and have strengthened their safety nets. This has been done primarily by increasing the public debt, which was the right thing to do under these circumstances. Other countries, for instance, some Latin American countries such as Venezuela, Argentina, and Ecuador, which were already facing severe economic conditions before the pandemic, are finding it hard to finance the social protection schemes by issuing public debt at relatively low yields. Problems in the developing world are even more serious and cannot be overlooked. One of the lessons of the pandemic is that there are very large, huge, I would say, spillovers across nations. as vaccine should cover the entire population of a planet as soon as possible to avoid new mutation of the virus, so do income support to the poorest. They cannot ignore billions of individuals. It's a matter of our health. Among the proposals discussed by the policy brief prepared by the T20 task force, there is a project to develop a safety net covering the poorest countries in the world. This scheme could be funded by a global wealth tax on the stock market capitalization of a large corporation. The G20 could coordinate the international effort to move in this direction. It could also promote the circulation of best practices in reorienting unskilled workers hit by the crisis towards new technologies and toward the demands of the health and care sector. This will require the development of new tools, such as, for instance, wage insurance schemes and the revamping of employer-based qualification training. Thank you.
Well, Professor, thank you. Thank you very much. I mean, you already pinpointed one very fundamental request that I do hope that will be discussed at the G20. Now I'd like to introduce James McGann, Director of the Think Tanks of Civil Societies Program and Lauder Institute, University of Pennsylvania. Professor, good morning. I think it's early morning there. We
Yes,
already have afternoon.
you are correct. It is still morning, early morning here. I want to come in. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, because I mean, we have got for you, I mean, we are all very, very curious now about the United States suddenly. I mean, you have got a new president and things are going to change, I suppose, radically, rapidly. And I would like to ask you, well, first of all, how? I mean, we have heard Biden yesterday, we heard him at the Super Bowl speaking about his international view. He spoke about relationship with China, very blunt, very outspoken, about Iran. But I mean, how do you think this Biden presidency will reshape multilateralism? And what do you know that, I mean, G20 will have to take into consideration? What is your opinion?
Well, President Biden and his foreign policy team have asserted repeatedly, and as you mentioned last night at the Super Bowl, gave in terms of opportunity to make his interest policies known to the world, given the large audience for the Super Bowl. He has repeatedly, since coming to office, made it clear that America, diplomacy, and multilateralism are back. He has also admitted that it's going to take time to rebuild what has been so badly damaged. But he made the commitment. That's precisely what we are going to do. The Biden administration will provide a stark contrast to Trump's relations with both friends, competitors, and foes. The Biden administration will be clearly more diplomatic, more normal, consistent, and guided by evidence and experts. The Biden, and I think an intangible dimension is his leadership. Biden connects with people, whether they are heads of state or the guy on the street, and has demonstrated a consistency in approach, analysis, and engagement as a senator, vice president, and now president. In his first day of office, he has set out his foreign policy and domestic priorities and issued a number of executive orders that, with the strike of a pen, had the U.S. rejoin the Paris Accord on climate change, the World Health Organization, lifted the Muslim travel ban, and made climate change a national security priority. Let me highlight what will likely be the framework for Biden's policy priorities, foreign policy priorities, in the next 4 years. First, he has a clear understanding that support for a constructive U.S. foreign policy begins at home, and this is dependent on the rapid and effective response to COVID-19 and rebuilding the economy. Secondly, a deep and enduring commitment to rekindling ties with key allies around the world and renewing our commitment to alliances like NATO, multilateral organizations like the UN, and, of course, active participation in the G20. Thirdly, he believes and is focusing on restoring the focus on democracy and human rights and raising these issues with leaders of countries like Russia around the Navalny issue, China on Tibet, the Uyghurs and Hong Kong, in Myanmar, and in Saudi Arabia. Fourthly, staying focused on the existential security issues we face: nuclear war, climate change, and pandemics, while keeping an eye on potential flashpoints with North Korea, China in the South China Sea, Hong Kong, tensions between India and China, Russia's cyber attacks and military threats in Eastern and Central Europe, to name a few. His father said to him, and I will quote, he called him Champ. He said, "Champ, if you focus on everything, you focus on nothing." And he will remain laser focused on the existential threats in terms of foreign policy. Asserting a set of foreign policy priorities and changing the tone of US diplomacy is one thing. Conducting foreign policy, i.e., managing it at home and abroad, is another matter. Here are three immediate challenges facing the Biden administration. One, getting a deeply divided American electorate to support his foreign policy priorities. As I've stated, this will depend in part on how he handles the pandemic and restarting the economy. He will also have to effectively engage both Democrats and Republicans in the Senate. And let me point out that in the US, any treaty requires 2/3 of the Senate to approve a treaty. President Biden has his a foreign policy team have repeatedly focused on rebuilding what has been badly damaged. The struggle here, or the challenge, is rallying friends and allies to support a unified front in combating climate change, proliferation of nuclear weapons, protecting democracies, and human rights, and assisting countries that have been badly ravaged by COVID-19. Managing the nuances, complexities, and interrelated dimensions of US relations with both our friends, competitors, and foes will be a daunting task. Clearly, Biden has his work cut out for him, but he is up to the task and has surrounded himself with experts who can help guide the US through turbulent and uncharted waters. Let me end with a quote from Biden and his assessment in 2016 what the next administration will face. He said, "We will have to contend with uniting the Western Hemisphere, deepening our alliances and partnerships in Asia, managing complex relationships with regional powers, and addressing severe transnational challenges such as climate change and terrorism." The reality is the only things that would now add it to that are three. One, the challenge of both domestic and international terrorism, clearly the pandemic, and the inevitable black swan that will face his administration sometime during the course of the next 4 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. And we sure do see, even in this few weeks, I mean, it is evident, I think, to everybody that, I mean, something has really radically changed in Washington, and maybe to many it's also a big relief. Questions are coming in from our viewers, and I would like to start a second row of questions, and I'd like to go back to Professor Pascal Allotti. from Laila Simoncelli, that is viewing us online. I just read to you her question that sounds like this. What will the G20's commitment to making vaccines and pandemic treatments a global public good for all? What do you think? That would that be liberalizing the patent protection and licensing? And then what I would add, I would like to know your point of view regarding data sharing, because the pandemic has made it very, very clear that one can only get out of it with cooperation, which is also, I mean, scientists did come up with various vaccines, probably because they did have collaboration without any regard of borders or nations. And that was probably the first time that it has been done in such a hurry and so well, is to be said. So what do you think? I mean, should the vaccine be liberalized and the patent protection be taken off? And should one share as much data as possible? Of course, I mean, there are some countries that think differently, but what do you think that G20 should commit on this?
So if I take the data question first, I mean, clearly, well, I guess for both questions, clearly within the context of a pandemic and a crisis situation like this, there does need to be some change. But the critical thing is that change is, it's the crisis may be a catalyst, but it does show that change is possible. And the sharing of data was the generosity was incredible in the data sharing that made the vaccine development and testing usually a multi-year endeavor possible within a very short period of time. You know, the genetic sequence of the virus was shared, clinical trials data was shared, and so on. And WHO has established platforms for learning and sharing of expertise. I mean, it is. I think this has really been unprecedented. But there is always room to do better. I think there's been a mushrooming of data platforms that are often duplicative, inefficient, and the quality is unclear. The capacity to optimize the analysis and interpretation is often limited to a handful of institutions, usually in the global north. Which leads to the control of the narrative about what works regardless of the context. Low and middle income countries are often reduced to being data collectors for scientists who generate real knowledge in the institutions in the global north. So what should WHO and the G20 do? I would suggest, again, three points. One, invest in and strengthen established national and regional bodies. I refer, for instance, to the WHO Regional Health Observatory, Centers for Diseases Control, national data warehouses, and so on. The hard work has been done already in establishing their credibility, the public function, and the infrastructure. And a concrete proposal would be to enhance their function and ensure they remain depoliticized, so that we don't have to invent new wheels. Secondly, we need to strengthen the collection and sharing of disaggregated data. The inequities are very clear, as I mentioned before, with the pandemic. There needs to be disaggregated data by gender, by ethnicity, indigeneity, migration, and so on. We know that these are the social determinants, and we need to understand what the dynamics are in order to make sure that we leave no one behind. Third point is recognition of different types of data, because there's only so much that we can learn from the current measurable indicators that are provided by epidemiology and so on. And finally, data sharing offers an opportunity to establish mechanisms for coordination, I think, between governments, the private sector, and philanthropy, to be able to tie together the critical areas for regulation, sharing, accountability, and scale up. And this ensures that the change that we've got now is change that can be sustainable. Very quickly on the patent protection and licensing question, I think, again, we are in unprecedented times. And I think the relaxing of regulation for the moment that we're in is necessary. I think it also gives us pause to rethink in the future what has not worked in licensing before, and how we can build it back better.
Thank you, Professor Aloti. Now I have got a second question also for Professor Tito Boeri regarding students, regarding school. They have been very badly hit. I mean, in Italy, we know, I mean, most of our sons and daughters, I mean, they're still at home studying online with all the difficulties that comes with, and all the inequalities as well. So I wanted to ask you, what could G20 do, I mean, to address this big challenge? Because this 1 year has put young people, students, under a considerable amount of stress. And these students, they will be anyhow tomorrow's workers, tomorrow's class. And so what should one do?
Well, there is little doubt that education should be a priority for G20 government, especially under these circumstances. Because education is, first of all, the main social elevator, the one providing some remedy to the inequality of opportunities that is prevailing worldwide. And during the pandemic, there were serious problems in this respect, as I was already reminding before. About 500 million children had no or limited access to remote learning in the first wave of the contagion. We don't have as yet data for the second wave. I expect that there were not many less than this number. And they were coming mostly from marginalized segments of the population. Where remote digital learning was accessed, there are also indications of limited success, particularly for those in disadvantaged circumstances. Furthermore, child well-being and protection have been under address, which may further exacerbate the harms. Inequalities will compound on those in existing emergency and conflict context, and those facing hardcore exclusion due to intersecting factors of gender, race, language, and disability. There are serious concerns that the closure of schools will increase not only static but also dynamic inequality, that is, the mobility of persons over the income ladder. G20 government should do whatever they can to prevent the loss of entire generations. It is a cost that we cannot afford in aging societies, and it is a very harmful threat to social cohesion. Governments should first of all identify marginalized and most fragile groups of students by implementing in the coming months broad and systematic data collection to measure the educational gaps of students through, for example, standardized tests. This will enable them to develop policy to support by providing accessible distance education, developing school reintegration programs, adapt regular curriculum, and introduce accelerated learning catch-up programs, strengthening teacher capacity and education personnel. G20 should also promote learning from best practices in pedagogies, focusing on the most vulnerable groups, regular assessment and feedback, different kinds of tutoring, low-tech innovation, other learning acceleration programs, such as teaching at the right level, among others. In other words, education should be priority number one for G20 governments.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you. And I have got a second question also for James McGann, a question that comes from the people who are watching, listening. I suppose this comes from a person called Gärtner, suppose from Germany, but that's just a supposition. That's all I can see. He wants to know how Alliance for Democracy, I mean, the words of Biden, how will that link together with multilateralism? I suppose, if I may, he probably wants to know what you think will his approach be towards China and Russia. Will it be an approach, let's say, more confrontational, or what?
I think it will be as I indicated, particularly or specifically with countries like Russia and China and others, the relationship is complex. There are a number of both strategic and national security concerns that need to be balanced and managed. So it is not an easy task, but I think there is a clear difference, both in tone and in substance. Trump was long on slogans and short on substance. Biden is clear, and the focus on an alliance of democracies is consistent with the desire to unite the countries and existing alliances, realizing that we're not going to demonize the Chinese or Russians, but we need to be realistic about certain areas, certainly in human rights with the Navalny issue, and in Hong Kong, and in growing repression and assertiveness in China, that the unified response, both in the US and abroad, needs to be realistic about the challenges. And if the world can do anything, or our allies can do anything to help the Biden administration, is to forge closer ties and a realistic assessment of the challenges that we face, particularly or specifically with competitors and those who are really the foes of the US and the community of democracies around the world, because they are under threat. And there is a effort to divide and conquer the countries in the West, and we need to realize that, not with an overemphasis on the belligerent approach, but a realistic approach, that these are challenges, they are real, and they require a response. And Biden, once again, in his first meeting with Putin, in stark contrast to Trump, raised very thorny issues. And I will assume that in conversations with Xi Jinping, there will be similar conversations. And we will all be better off if, in terms of Europe and our allies in Asia, Latin America, and elsewhere, are aware of those realities and are supportive of Biden's effort to lead as partners and peers in the challenges we face in the coming years.
Well, thank you so much, Professor. We are now at the closing round. I have got one curiosity, a personal curiosity. I mean, I was quite struck by the change between former administration Trump and Biden regarding, let's say, Saudi Arabia. I mean, Biden said very clearly priorities are human rights, and he wants the Yemen war to end, which is quite a different story from what Trump used to say. I would like to ask if you can summarize, I mean, what do you expect will change in the Middle East, and especially, I mean, Trump was a great friend of the Saudi kings. What do you expect Biden to do now?
I don't think that there will be a dramatic change, because in terms of the key countries in the region and our allies, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and the reality and the revelation yesterday that that in terms of Iran, that Iran is not going to abandon its development of nuclear weapons, that we will remain steadfast in our support for our allies in the region. We'll build bridges with key countries in the region beyond the Gulf states, and we need them, and that it's essential for all of us that there's a unified stance, and that delicate relationship within the region is managed carefully. That being said, the human rights issue will not be ignored.
Thank you, Professor. Now, there is a question for Professor Boeri that comes direct to him from Matthias Urban, suppose German too. And he's asking if G20 could ensure that the focus on education would include a strong focus on early childhood development, education and care, and could that be made into a global common good?
No doubt, it's very important to really work on early childhood, also because there are very important non-cognitive skills that are being developed at this very early stages. And so it's very important that there is a careful attention to this type of issues. So we will work also on this. Our task force for the T20 is providing a suggestion also in this respect. So thank you for raising this issue.
And there's another question that I suppose would always be more economical. What about supporting the South African and Indian joint request before the WTO for access to vaccines? I mean, that's a question, I suppose, for you and Professor Alotti.
Sorry, that was if you can clarify, this was a request for access to vaccines for. Sorry, can you clarify the question?
Well, I just get it from the viewers. I mean, what about supporting the South African and Indian joint request? I suppose that what they mean is the access to vaccines for even the more vulnerable countries. I mean, thinking mostly about Africa and Southeast Asia.
I guess a lot of that still reiterates the issues that I had raised before. That we are not safe until everyone is safe, and so the access does need to be opened up. We do need to think about the G20 needs to really think about what models would be possible. But I think the reassuring thing is that the vaccines market really has opened up. The concern, the greatest concern, I would say, is the tendency now for hoarding, which totally closes off access for a resource that is currently limited, but doesn't have to be. And that opening up needs to happen. And I think that's where the G20 leadership needs to be, really pushing back for a global equity model.
Professor McGann, I mean, you are the director of the Think Tanks and Civil Societies program. Now, with the Biden administration, you have a more multilateral attitude, even towards the administration itself. It's not one man at the lead like it was, let's say, 2 months ago, but he is a man who likes teamwork. So what are also the contribution that think tanks can have? What is the idea that you have of how the interaction with this new president will be?
Well, 2 points. One is I want to commend the Italian T20 for what I describe as a commitment to make the T20 and G20 as modern as the global marketplace of ideas by focusing on inclusion, a digital approach, and policy relevance. I think more importantly, in terms of what you have raised, we, and this is the importance of civil society, throughout the Trump administration, think tanks in the US and elsewhere were on the front lines in addressing very early on in the crisis the need to focus and develop policies that would help save lives and livelihoods. So thousands of think tanks around the world joined together in early April, came together and developed a series of proposals to address the public health crisis, the economic crisis, the need to address vulnerable populations, and to emphasize international cooperation. And so my point is that civil society, despite the Trump administration, was very active, and the TTCSP was very active in engaging the global community. And from my standpoint, emphasizing the importance that while, the administration may not be supportive of multilateralism and international organizations, institutions, think tanks, and other civil society organizations in the US were actively involved in building and sustaining the relationships with institutions. And that will continue and be a little easier under the Biden administration, as it was with the Biden and Obama administration.
Thank you so much, Professor McGannon. Of course, Biden was the vice president when Obama was there. Now he's president. And that, I wanted probably one of the last round of questions. I wanted to ask Professor Boeri. First, we talked about how this pandemic accelerates inequalities and what the risks are involved in this acceleration that is happening worldwide. And we can even observe it here in Europe. There is another divide that is deepening, that is the gender divide. In Italy, and surely he has seen the figures, it's mostly women who lost their jobs. And there is another issue that, let's say, in Europe hasn't become central as it has in the States, race question. We have had, during the year of the pandemic, two major events that went global. Black Lives Matter. They have stressed and put into the front light very, very deep questions, especially regarding the United States, but not only. Just see what happened in Africa, in many African states, in the UK, in France. So how do you think one should address, or do you think the G20 should address these two questions?
Undoubtedly, the pandemic has increased, as I was saying before, inequality, and has put segments, very important segment of the population in very difficult conditions. And certainly there is a marked gender dimension of this inequality that has increased. In many advanced countries, being the service sectors, those being mostly hardly hit by the lockdowns, it were women to be those losing jobs, compared to, for instance, previous recession, like the Great Recession, where it was instead manufacturing, the key sectors being involved, and therefore also men were particularly hardly hit. So there is certainly a gender issue, which is very serious and should be addressed. And we are thinking specifically about how to deal with that, and how to help women to find a new job and to reintegrate into other sectors of the economy, if clearly the sectors they were working on will not immediately recover from the pandemic. But more broadly, there are also other disadvantaged groups, and there are clearly racial dimension, age dimensions of these inequalities. And these are very serious threats to social cohesion, because these inequalities have increased for reasons that are completely independent of effort, of merit. Also, there are people who actually gain a lot from the pandemic and increase very much their wealth because they found themselves in the right sectors. Those, for instance, very much engaged in online distribution. And people do not understand why this is going on. And clearly there are ways, but we should find better ways to deal with that. And we should find better way also the tax wealth of the top income recipients. And it should be done this at the international level. There is no way to do this at the national level because capital is extremely mobile. And that's why, as I was saying before, among the proposal that we are discussing, there is also this global wealth tax that should fund a safety net, a minimum scheme, minimum income scheme to be guaranteed and paid worldwide, in particular in the developing world.
Well, Professor, thank you. Thank you very much. And I do thank all of you for your time, for your thoughts that you shared with us, and of course for your patience. But I do think that, well, this is probably the first, but even the most important session, because people are really, or should be, at the center of all policies, all governments. So I thank Pascal Alotti, I thank the Professor James McGann, of course, even Emma Bonino who left us, and Professor Tito Mueri, and all of you who have been watching. And I also thank, of course, ISPI, who made all this possible. Thank you very much. And I leave you to the next panel regarding planets. Thank you very much.